This video is sponsored by Codeco.com. Hey, what's up everyone? Vegetarian Zombie here from Learn, Create, Play. And in this episode, we're going to explore the wild, wild world of Null. Null is such an important aspect of C#. It's kind of everywhere and affects everything you do. Now, before I dive into Null and what it means, give this video a like and, of course, hit that subscribe button. Okay, so what is Null? Well, let's take an example. Imagine you are a math teacher who created a quiz grading program. You decided early on that the grades will be a type of uint. This means an unsigned integer, aka no negative numbers. Great. You write your program and get to work. On the first day of a test, you notice a student is out sick. What quiz grade should you provide for that student? You could use a 0, but a 0 is an actual grade. Being you only have positive numbers, you choose 1000. This means whenever the student is out, you must remember to put in a 1000 as a grade. Now, if you're using just a regular int, you could use a -1, but that's also confusing without any documentation. For your current iteration, every absent student receives 1000. If you make a mistake and put in 10,000, then they get a God tier grade, and that's a problem. Thankfully, there is a solution which is the topic of this very episode. You use null. Null indicates the absence of a value. This means if a student doesn't take a test, they get a null grade for that test. And yes, you can use null everywhere. Imagine that you have a game that supports 2-player couch co-op, but only one player plays the game. Player 2 is null. If you ask a person for their first name and last name and they only provide their first name, then the last name is null. Now, null is helpful, but it's also very dangerous. It's like the Terminator. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and if you try to operate on a null value, it will crash your program. Thankfully, we have lots of tools that we can use to check for null, and you'll learn a bunch of them in this course. For now, you have to get used to the idea that null will eventually appear and wreck your good time. If you've already run into a null reference error, then you've already made null's acquaintance. And if you haven't, you will, sooner rather than later. Now, before we start playing with null, we have to return back to variables. You learned when we create a variable, we give it a type. So a name would be a string, and a temperature might be a double. But these types fall into two categories, a value type and a reference type. And this deals with how variables are stored in your computer's memory. When you use a value type, the computer stores that value in a single space of memory. So when we assign a variable to another variable, we are actually copying that value in memory. This is as expected. But with a reference type, the data lives in a place called the heap. This is for complex data types. For instance, the scripts we are writing live on the heap. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into this right now. Don't worry, it's coming soon enough. I mention it because value types handle nulls differently than reference types. For now, think of all the types we've used so far and try to guess which is a reference type. There's just one. Okay, let's play with nulls, but before we start, here's a word from my sponsor, Kodeco.com. Codeco is a site for developers made by developers. With hundreds of instructors from around the world, you can learn about topics such as native iOS development, native Android development, and even multi-platform development with Flutter. Codeco also features hundreds of free articles, including topics on game development, covering both Unity and Unreal. As a Pro subscriber, you can access a library of thousands of videos on a range of development topics. The curated learning paths are designed to teach the basics of development in a friendly and supportive way. Pro subscribers also have complete access to all the books at Codeco, such as the Unity Apprentice, that aims to teach you Unity by creating a series of different games. Get started on your programming journey today by heading on over to Codeco.com. Okay, to get started, open your project in progress. We're going to create a new script. Call it my null. Attach it to the text and remove the current script. Now, we're not going to connect the button as this is just going to be a quick demo. We'll just print out to the console. Open up the script. Now let's create a couple of names. We'll create a first name and a last name. I added my first name but skipped the last name. You'll notice we can set the string just to null. This tells us that the string is a reference type. Strings are strange in C#. They act like value types, but they actually live on the heap. Let's print it out. Now, give this a think. What do you think will be printed to the console? Try to reason the result, and don't worry if you get it wrong. Switch back to Unity and start the game. Now switch to the console. If you don't see the console tab, select Window, General, Console. You'll see it prints just your first name, but ignores the null. Switch back to your code. Now let's call a method on the string. I'll be explaining methods soon enough. This uppercases the string. Now what will be printed out? We're trying to uppercase a value that doesn't exist. Switch back and run the game. You'll see we get a reference error. In fact, it's a null reference. You are trying to use a reference that doesn't exist. Now switch back to your code editor. Let's create an integer. We get an error because an int is a value type. We have to opt into null by doing the following. Now let's use this number. Here you just learned your next operator. It's called a null coalescing operator. What do you think is printed out to the screen? Let's test your assumption. Switch back to Unity. Run your game. Look at that, 42. What is happening is when assigning a value to true number, the code first checks the meaning of life variable. If there is a null value, it uses the other value, which is 42. Thus, 42 is assigned to the true number. Now, what if the second number value was null? Well, you can use another null coalescing operator on the same line. The result is still the same. Now, there are lots of other null-aware operators that you'll learn throughout this course. The main takeaway is to be aware of null values. They'll bite you in places that you will not expect. And yes, they bite both new and old programmers alike, so don't be hard on yourself when you run into a null error. It's bound to happen. In the next episode, we'll dive into the world of control flow by introducing you to if statements. If statements are the cornerstone for adding logic to your games. So take a quick break, and I'll see you in the next one.